Hello, it's Jamie from Beacon Consultant Services. Thanks for tuning in to our 14th video on the A to Z of GDPR. Today we're going to be focusing on N for national security, which is one of those things not included within GDPR, but it does appear as an exemption under the DPA 2018. So more specifically, we're going to be looking at those things not covered and those exemptions. Now under GDPR and DPA 2018, they set out some exemptions from some of the rights and obligations in certain circumstances. So it's important to note that you shouldn't routinely rely on these exemptions. You should assess on a case-by-case basis, and you should justify and document your decisions that has led you to using an exemption. And if no exemption applies, then you must comply with the GDPR. So there are some things that aren't exemptions, as I mentioned, and these are just not covered by the GDPR. So here are some examples of those. So for domestic purposes, so if personal data is processed in the course of a purely personal or household activity with no connection to a professional or commercial activity, it's outside the scope of GDPR. So this means that if you only use personal data for such things as writing to friends and family or taking pictures for your own enjoyment, you're not subject to the GDPR. Law enforcement. So the processing of personal data by competent authorities for law enforcement purposes is outside the GDPR scope. So for example, if the police are investigating a crime, instead this type of processing is subject to the rules contained within the DPA 2018. And national security. So personal data processed for the purposes of safeguarding national security or defence is outside the GDPR scope. However, again, this is covered within the DPA 2018, which contains an exemption for national security and defence. So back to exemptions. Now these are useful because they can relieve you from some of the obligations for things within GDPR, such as the right to be informed, the right of access, dealing with other individual rights, reporting personal data breaches, or complying with the principles. So how do the exemptions work? Well, some exemptions apply simply because you have a particular purpose, but others only apply to the extent that complying with GDPR would be likely to prejudice your purpose. So for example, it may have a damaging or a detrimental impact on what you're doing, or prevent or seriously impair you from processing in a way that is required or is necessary. So let's take a look at those exemptions in more detail. So I'll just run through some examples here of the sorts of things captured under each of these exemptions. There's obviously a lot more detail under each of these, but I can't go through all of it in this small video. So the first is crime law and public protection exemption. So this is to prevent and detect crimes, to apprehend and prosecute offenders, where there's a claim to a legal professional privilege, immigration control, etc. The regulation, parliament and judiciary exemption. So if you're processing personal data for the purpose of discharging a regulatory function under a specific legislation in relation to a number of different bodies, such as the ICO, the FCA, the Charities Commission, etc., to avoid privileges of either houses of parliaments being infringed. The journalism, research and archiving exemption. So this is for journalistic or artistic purposes, scientific or historic research, archiving in the public interest. Health, social work, education and child abuse exemption. So if the data could cause serious harm, this kind of data, or child abuse data, for example. Finance, management and negotiations exemption. So corporate financial data, management forecasts, negotiations, those sorts of things are covered under that. Reference and exams, so confidential references, exam scripts and exam marks, for example. And subject access requests, where it applies to information about other people. And this is in order to protect the rights of those third parties. So there you have it, that's N for national security, which we've stolen really to talk about exemptions. But please feel free to join us for our next video, which will be on O for objections. Thank you.